With Surging Sparks right around the corner, we're getting a head start by building early deck lists so that you'll be ready when it releases November 8th. If you're after a specific card that you'd like me to cover next, drop a comment down below to let me know, but today we're going to be focusing on 3 ways that you can play Milotic EX. If you haven't seen Milotic EX yet, it's a pretty unique card thanks to the ability Sparkling Scales, making it ignore all damage from attacks of Tera Pokémon. While this might not be quite as effective as something like Mimikyu, who's immune to all EX and V Pokémon, it still makes it an effective wall against a good chunk of the meta. Any deck that's relying exclusively on Tera Pokémon for their attackers are going to have a tough time taking even a single prize against Milotic. But Milotic isn't just a defensive wall that you're going to chuck in the active and just wait till your opponent decks out. It's actually a pretty solid attacker thanks to Hypno Splash, which does 160 damage and puts your opponent's active Pokémon to sleep, adding another layer of disruption and helping against non-Tera Pokémon. This is perfect for matchups like Raging Bolt EX where they could potentially deal damage to Milotic, but now they'll need to flip a coin to see if they can even attack or find another way to bypass the sleep effect like using a switch out. Now while I did say Mimikyu's ability was a little bit more effective, giving you invincibility into EXs and Vs, I didn't say you couldn't include it in the deck too. Chucking Mimikyu in the active is a great way to buy some time while you set up your Milotics, especially because it's a basic Pokemon you could start in the active. But why stop there? We can also include other effectively invincible Pokemon for different matchups. Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon is going to be immune to damage from Pokemon that have abilities. This is great for non-Tera Pokemon like Pidgeot EX and even V-Stars like Lugia. Not to mention single prize Pokemon that have abilities won't be able to hit him either. There's also Noivern, which becomes immune to damage from basic Pokemon after it uses its attack, needing just 2 colorless energy to do it, and Frigoraph EX, whose ability blocks damage from basic Pokemon EX, so it's perfect for countering decks like Raging Bolt, and unlike Noivern, you don't need to use an attack to get that effect off. So it's not like your opponent can just gust you out of the active, gust you back up, and then hit you. It's like, no, that ability's gonna stick. It does mean that you're going to take damage from single prize Pokemon like Radiant Charizard though, so that's kind of where Noivern has a little bit more going for it than the Frigoraph, and Frigoraph's only immune into EXs, not basic V Pokemon. Since these walls are only effective into specific matchups, that does mean there'll be times that you open the wrong Pokemon though and end up moving it to the bench, going into your wall for that matchup. Your opponent can then just gust around you, bringing up that thing that you initially started and trying to take a prize off that, getting around the thing that they can't hit. But that's why it's important to be very mindful of what you're benching and only putting down Pokemon with immunities suited for each matchup when you can, and limiting the amount of potential prizes you put onto your board so that your opponent never has a way to actually take 6 prizes without going into one of your walls that just says, you can't hit me. You can literally do nothing against me. To help out in case you do overbench, or if you start out something that's less than ideal, we do have Professor Turo letting you just scoop something up, putting it into your hand and healing it. It's also a great way to just let you tank a few hits. Now, even if you do have a bench where everything is immune, you do still have to watch out for Canceling Clone. This item card can remove your active Pokemon's abilities, so always try to have at least 2 Pokemon in play in case your opponent goes Canceling Clone, I'm gonna knock out your active, because if you only have one thing in play, you're just out of Pokemon and lose the game. So try and have 2 walls in play at most times, at least until you see that Canceling Clone get used. Most decks do only run 1 copy, so as long as you have multiple walls in play, you should be fine, since they might take out 1 Milotic, but that doesn't mean they can deal with 2 of them. Not to mention, Canceling Clone's gonna rotate out pretty soon, so you only really have to worry about it until the springtime. Another thing to be cautious of is attacks with effects that can bypass your abilities, like Shred, or Roaring Moon, who can use Frenzied Gouging and just say, hey, you're knocked out. They're not doing damage, they're just saying, you're knocked out. But since Dusknoir's been around and is a pretty hard counter for Roaring Moon, it's kind of fallen off the meta recently, so it's seeing a bit less play. Don't really need to stress out about that one too much. If you are worried though, you can include Mist Energy for protection from effects like that. It's only going to block the Roaring Moon though, it doesn't protect you against Shred. Shred will still get through Mist Energy. Speaking of Dusknoir though, that is something you do need to be aware of, since they can put damage counters on you with an ability. They're not using an attack, they just go, hey, knock this out. Damage counters. But we even have a solution for that in Gastrodon, which shuts off abilities of bench stage 2 Pokemon. This makes it harder for your opponents to use their Dusknoirs. They can still technically get around it by putting their Dusknoir into the active, then knocking it out, and they could even just check those damage counters onto the Gastrodon if they want, so they could use another Dusknoir. It's not a foolproof plan, but it definitely makes them work for taking some prizes. We do also include Lost City in most of these lists today, so any Dusknoirs that use their ability, they get knocked out. They're not doing that again. They're gone. Another card showing up in all the builds today is going to be the Ace Spec Hero's Cape. This will give our Pokemon added bulk, so in the early game, if you're worried about your pre-evolutions getting taken out, you can just chuck this on one of them to keep them a little bit safer, or put it on one of your attackers so that they're a little too bulky, so even if your opponent does play something like Canceling Cologne to try and get one hit off, they're likely not doing enough damage to take one shot into you. Then if that Pokemon does get close to getting knocked out though, like they half hit you, we do have Professor Turo we mentioned earlier, so just scoop it up and reset it. The cape goes away, but that's fine, our Pokemon's back at full health. One last thing before we do get into the list, most of the Pokemon we've discussed need 3 energy to attack, but since 2 of them are colorless, we can easily use double turbo energy to speed up your setup and start attacking pretty quickly, needing just 1 more energy of their respective type to get going. And the last thing is, if you're finding any of this info useful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to keep up with the shenanigans. That's the core concept of Milotic EX though, so now let's dive into the full deck list to help you start pulling off these game-winning strategies. Alright, so the first deck we're going to cover is kind of the most straightforward way to play it. We did mention the Noivern EX, who has Covert Flight. You do 70 damage for 2 colorless energy. During your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this by attacks from basic Pokemon. So that does cover EXs, Vs, and single prizers. Obviously, being the effect of an attack, your opponent can just gust around the Noivern and go into something else, so it can be a little bit tricky, but a great option to have. We are seeing the Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon in here, and of course our Milotic showing up. Mimikyu is a great wall to start out in the active, and even including a Rotom V just to kind of help out with some draw power in the early game. Forest Seal Stone showing up in here as well, so we can get a V-Star power off the Rotom, which is really nice, kind of helping with that setup, and then just use Professor Turo to get this off your bench at some point so you only have your effective walls in play for the matchup. The supporter cards, for the most part, are pretty much just staples of the standard format. We do have Roseanne's backup showing up though, since we are running double turbo energy. We've got the Lost Cities and even a tool card in Hero's Cape. Roseanne's backup can get a Pokemon, a tool, a stadium, and an energy from our discard pile and put them back into their deck. So it's going to get your Lost Cities, your DTEs, your Hero's Cape, and even one of your Pokemon back in, which is also very, very useful. Being able to get 2 or potentially even 3 Hero's Cape. Did I have Palpad in this list? I don't. Only 2 Hero's Cape, but still. Adding on an extra 100 HP onto your guys is very useful. Roxanne for some disruption and draw power in the late game, and Crispin just for a little bit of extra energy acceleration. Being able to go into this with something like Forest Seal Stone, so chuck that onto the Rotom, get Crispin out, then use Crispin, grab 2 energies of different types, attach 1 to a Pokemon, 1 into your hand, attach it for turn. As long as you got an attachment on the first turn, that means you don't even need to have hit a DTE to get an attacker online as early as turn 2. Obviously a little bit situational, likely more like a mid to late game play where you're going to be using the Crispin just to get a secondary attacker online, but the option is there. If you have any questions about the list, feel free to ask me in the comments down below, but let's get into the next list, which is going to be one including Palkia V-Star. So Milotic obviously being a water Pokemon, well, we can use Palkia to help get some energy onto it. Star Portal lets you get 3 basic water energy cards from your discard pile and attach them to your water Pokemon in any way that you'd like. Milotic needs 3 energy to attack, so effectively we could go Palkia, charge up a Milotic in one go. We do still have DTE in this build, so it means we could chuck 1 water energy onto 1 Milotic, 2 onto another one, and then just attach a DTE to get 1 online and just be an attachment for turn the following turn away from getting another Milotic set up. So it's definitely a great option to be able to go into. Professor Turo showing up in this list as well, so after we use Palkia, we can just scoop it up and be in a really great spot. And we even have Forest Seal Stone in this build as well, so we could be chucking that on the Palkia to use that instead of going for the Star Portal ability. Like if you're just going to go, hey, I've already got DT and a water energy on Milotic, I happen to find a Palkia V mid to late game, chuck a Forest Seal Stone on it, get something else out of your deck, then Turo it up later, and also having that Rotom combo in here as well. Gastrodon showing up in this list, we did cover it earlier, so I'm not going to go over that one. And then the Noivern and the Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon in this build as well. The rest of the list I feel like is pretty consistent with the one we just covered though, but any questions, feel free to let me know, guys. And the final build we're going to be covering is the Farigiraf EX one. So the ability on here, Armor Tail, is going to prevent all damage done to this by attacks from your opponent's basic Pokemon EX. Obviously a bit situational, but just gives you another option to use with your Milotic. So this is great into obviously basic EX dependent decks. That's your Raging Bolts, your Ogerpons, Roaring Moon, kind of, they've got the effect off gouging, frenzied gouging, so they can still knock you out. If they try and use the first attack though, which does damage, you would ignore that, but they just wouldn't use that. I feel like post-rotation for Giraffe could probably be the go-to one, but currently the other two lists kind of have a bit more of my attention. This is definitely a fun concept to play around with though. Dirty Beam does 160 damage and 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, so it can be helpful to kind of help set up numbers and doing some solid chip damage into opponents, obviously going for 2 to 3 shots into them. Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon showing up in here, Gastrodon showing up, the Milotic being in here, and the Mimikyu for just that starting wall, and Rotom V showing up again. I hope you guys did enjoy these lists. If you have any questions, never hesitate to ask, and make sure to hit that like button to let me know, and subscribe to keep up with the content. Till next time though, stay golden, you Goombas.